stage.
They entered the password that would allow me to re-enter the pulpit. I just want to clarify something right up front. I, in my new role, get to visit our other locations, and then they ask me to be present and to coach and to preach, and then there's the larger body of Christ. So as the schedule allows, and it is most appropriate, I'm here to serve Pastor Billy, Pastor Paris. I'm privileged to preach and teach, but right now we're all trying to figure that out. And I just appreciate the honor, and I appreciate the gratitude, and I appreciate the well wishes for happy retirement. But let me just say again, I've been repositioned and not retired, and I'm just serving in a different capacity. I'm still part of the team, part of the staff, and I just consider it an absolute honor to be in the rotation here. You know, the Bible says one thing about greatness, but the world says another. Muhammad Ali referred to himself as the greatest. He says, I am the greatest, right? And so when he was at the peak of his career, he was on an airplane. And the story goes, a stewardess politely asked him to fasten his seatbelt, to which he replied, Superman don't need no seatbelt. And the stewardess, in her wisdom and tact, says, Mr. Ali, Superman don't need no airplane. So would you please fasten your seatbelt like everyone else? And I just thought about that moment, that story, how differently the world sees greatness. Because the world sees greatness as accomplishment and achievement that brings glory to oneself, right? And it results in entitlement, special privilege, which is what Ali was referring to. Now, he did fasten his seatbelt, and just in all fairness, he was being just humorous, but it did reflect a little bit of how the world sees greatness. But God sees greatness as sacrifice through serving others for the greater good. God does not see, nor does the Bible teach, that greatness is becoming a celebrity with a lot of followers and a lot of fans. In fact, greatness is viewed as serving others for the greater good. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was addressing this issue with his disciples. And we read in the 20th chapter, Jesus called them, his disciples, to him and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. Whoever should be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. And Jesus begins to spill out the seeds of the good news, or the gospel, which is at the root of his coming. And he's flipping the script, because what the disciples and the seekers of that day understood is greatness was attached to the authority and the power and the celebrity of the Roman Empire, which lasted 1,000 years. And all of the abuse and entitlement that came with that. The pathway to greatness is a journey and a process. It's not an event or a moment. And when we walk the path faithfully, God has a way of unexpectedly giving us an opportunity that can often become not only a growing moment, but a defining moment. And when we enter that moment, we are not aware at the time that it is a moment for greatness. It's only usually in hindsight we realize, wow, God set a stage, God created an opportunity, and influence was unleashed. And we are all on that path that goes through different seasons of life. So, we were talking about David last week, and we know the story. David was the teenage boy that slew the giant Goliath, and he was the champion of the Philistines that were oppressing the Israelites. This was bad on all fronts. And as tradition of that day sometimes espoused, to save the carnage of mass casualty, one people group would put forth a champion and challenge the other people group to do the same. Winner take all. And whichever champion would win, their people would then rule over the people of the losing champion. Well, the problem was for 40 days, there was no person bold enough to answer the challenge of the Philistines and Goliath's taunts. But then there was David. There was David. And so David said to Saul the king, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth," or only a youth. You're only a kid. "And he has been a man of war from his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him." Now, this is insane. Okay, this is one nasty teenager. You don't run after bears and lions. You run away from bears and lions. If they got the sheep, hey, you know what? That's too bad. One less sheep in the flock. But David had cultivated such a confidence in God that he says, "You know what? I'm going to get that sheep back." Can you imagine a teenage boy chasing a lion and a bear down? That's beyond my comprehension. All right. I caught him by his beard. I mean, lions have beards. Bears have beards. Struck him and killed him. And he says again, "Your servant has struck down both lions and bears." So it's just not one lion or one bear, all right? Lions and bears, plural. And this uncircumcised Philistine, which is, by the way, a swear phrase, okay, it's like one of the worst phrases that you could think of. Don't think of that, right? We're in church. "And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." And notice the reason. He is incensed with a right motive. God has been insulted. And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So let's look at the pathway to greatness, which we are all on. And that's why this series is extending after God's heart. Greatness begins by honoring God through serving others. That's how it begins. This is the conversation Jesus is having. See, David clearly saw himself as servant not only to God, but servant to the king that God had put over him. In other words, servant to the boss. I am no longer the boss. Right here in this congregation at the main campus, Pastor Billy Lyle is the boss. He's the king, and I serve at his pleasure. Guess what? How many of you have bosses? Pastor Paris was talking about this. How many of you have bosses? Some of you don't want to raise your hands. You actually work, you don't like your boss. Well, who the boss, right? And whether we like them or not, because many of them are flawed, God has ordained sovereignly that for some reason known only to him, you have the boss that you have whether you like him or not, whether you think he's good or not. Here's why: God is forming a character that can handle greatness within you. And we will find, we know this from looking at last week, Saul was not a very good boss. He was an insecure, controlling, paranoid, abusive boss. And David had to deal with this boss. But the story starts out really good because he slays Goliath. In other words, Saul's looking great right now. But here's the key. David refers to him as servant 3 times in this passage, in this conversation. And this never wavers, we find, even after Saul mistreats him over time. David always refers to him as servant. And in serving, we find in this experience, this entails stewarding well what belongs to others, because David was trained by shepherding his father's sheep. It wasn't his sheep. It wasn't his sheep. Jesus addresses this here in the Gospel of Luke 16. One who was faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. This is how God starts us out in the processing and the path and the journey to greatness. He starts out by allowing us a little, not giving us a lot. If then you have not been faithful in their unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? Stewardship begins by being faithful to take care and maximizing what belongs to others, no matter how good or bad the boss is. And God watches because He's forming the anvil of our character in the refining pot of fire. This is what God always does. But the journey then continues because David was faithful to take care of his father's sheep. So faithful that he wouldn't let one sheep go missing, even if it meant a bear and a lion had that sheep in his mouth. You talk about a great employee. I don't know about you, but if there's any people like that out there, boy, you want them to be on your team. So, the journey continues as character and intimacy is formed through the test of obscurity. Right? Now, shepherding was not only a lowly vocation, but a lonely vocation. It was not a popular or respected calling. It was one of the loneliest. As Pastor Paris preached last week, it was sheep are stink. And if you're around sheep, they attract flies. I moved from Pearl City to Waipio. In Pearl City, we could put food out like natto, and it would just attract flies. You say, wait, natto attracts flies anywhere. It would attract flies in heaven. Forget that. All right? But any kind of food in Pearl City attracts flies. We go to Waipio, there are no flies. There's lots of roaches, but there's no flies. Sheep attract flies because they stink. All right? This was a hated calling. And David, as we learned last week, he was the youngest of the brothers. And he was given the butt job. Now, what David did during that lowly, lonely time is significant because we could surmise that he used those times to deepen his devotional life with God. Probably he cultivated intimacy, received revelation on connecting to God, and wrote Psalms. He processed. He probably spent a lot of time in prayer. Nowhere do we find he grumbled as a shepherd boy. There's no indication Scripture gives us that he really pouted during the time he was given the scabby job. We know because Psalms exist that we can refer to that he probably journaled during the time of obscurity. He probably understood God's working in faithfulness as he slew the lions and the bears. He probably developed a depth, and we get to read some of those Psalms that came out of the reflections from those lowly, obscure, and lonely times that he crafted in his soul as a shepherd boy. What we do in those times, what we do in private, prepares us for how God will use us in public. And let that sink in. We can grumble and we can pout, we can blame, and we can act out. But God is watching. The God who put us there and allowed us to be there is watching how we'll process our soul and deal with the difficulty of obscurity and loneliness. And this is how greatness is formed. That's why, not too many of us can claim tremendous wealth and celebrity, but all of us can relate to young David. We've all had times like that, and probably some of us are in that place now. Well, be encouraged. The journey continues further because it continues further as skill is cultivated and confidence is gained by being faithful in the grind. Faithful in the grind. Shepherding was a grind. It was lowly, it was lonely, it was stinky, potentially dangerous, but it was a grind. And we find David makes a comment here. He says, when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, because I want to read this again because I think this is so cool, and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. What is David doing here? This tells us David processed the lessons from private experiences. In his mind, it was very clear that confidence emerged from his reflection on what God had allowed him to go through, as threatening and dangerous as it was. These reflections from earlier tests. He had God-given practice from different kinds of giants, and he was just sizing up Goliath. same size. Bugger is ugly. I can take him. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't hype. David, in private, as a shepherd in obscurity, in the grind of routine, had taken the curriculum God had given him and practiced. So he no doubt practiced his slingshot. He no doubt, not only did he journal some, he probably practiced his songwriting and musicianship. What do you do in your times of privacy and obscurity, loneliness and lowliness, when it's not happening and adrenaline is not flowing? You scroll social media and get jealous over everybody's travels and what they're eating, as Pastor Paris said last weekend, where they're going and who they're with. And you go, I'm just a shepherd boy. It's not happening for me. Why is everybody else getting blessed? You don't find David any hint in David's life, even as a teenager. You don't find any hint that this was his attitude. So when Goliath showed up, guess what? David was ready, and the rest is history. Nobody answered the call. David was bringing lunch for his brothers. And David looked, and something inside of him that was practiced and formed from killing lions and bears, that was going after his father's sheep, now he said, the king's men are being intimidated. The king is being insulted. Our people are being taunted. And he basically says, who is this uncircumcised Philistine who dares defy the armies of the living God? And an indignance that he had formed from killing lions and bears that was trying to steal his father's sheep came forward. And he says, I'll go. And he made a proclamation with confidence. And we know what happened. One shot. He slung the rock. Touchdown. Bang. And then he knew this because of having to deal with the lions and the bears. He made sure to decapitate Goliath. Because it's one thing to knock him out, it's one thing to truly take him out. That was the beginning of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which we now call CTE. And I say that with great sensitivity because this was for the good. This was for the good. You know, I ask you today, this morning, where are you in the journey to greatness? Because you can't get there without times of loneliness, lowliness, times of obscurity, times where you feel like, you know, God's kind of forgotten about me. It's not happening like I think it should be happening. Why is it happening for them? It's like God skipped me over. Back in the 1980s, because I'm an older guy, I had been over the college campus ministry at our mother church, Grace Bible Church, Honolulu. And while in Bible school, I was part of the Outrigger Hotel team as a night auditor. And I brought in a lot of other guys to help with the hotel, because there were multiple hotel chains. And consequently, I made good money. And I remember that working for the Kelly family, they wanted to put me in what was known as the executive management track. I was 23 years old. At the same time, I was asked by the pastor, senior pastor of Grace Bible Church, to teach school. They had just opened a Christian school. And I didn't want to do that. Because to me, teaching middle school kids compared to being an executive management track with the Kelly family Outrigger Hotels was a big demotion. But the call of God to ministry was already burning in me. But young, proud logic said, I want to go the other way. And I struggled greatly with the call of God. So I was not David. And then the church told me what they would pay me. That was frightening. because the outrigger hotels were going to pay me, well, in the job I was then in, I was making 4 times as much as the church was going to pay me. In the executive track, it was going to be, who knows, 10 times as much. And so in the anvil of personal prayer, I encountered anger at God. I've never shared this before in the 28 years. Kind of like, I don't know if I want to go into the ministry and listen to you. So I said yes to God begrudgingly and began to teach school and hated every minute. And that's not an exaggeration. I thought, not only do I dislike these kids, these obnoxious kids who themselves didn't want to be in this Christian school, I'm not making any money. So I'm becoming a pauper while suffering, taking care of kids, this flock of kids that didn't even want to be with me, most of whom didn't like me because I didn't like them. How do you know that's a bad situation? That's a bad situation. And you're saying, but God, I'm being obedient to you. Well, the first 2 years were hell on earth for me, hell on earth for them, and hell on earth for their parents. Because when it came time for parent-teacher conference, these parents, but mind you, I'm 23, so they're much older, they could tell I didn't like their kids, and if you don't like their kids, they don't like you. This was really bad. And I remember the senior pastor of the church, principal of the school, calling me into their office. When you're a teacher, you shouldn't be called into the principal's office. And I got rebuked. And they said, you need to get your attitude right, because this is the path to the call God has for you. But all I could see was outrigger hotels, executive management track. And I was comparing myself with other brothers that had formed their way into an eventual call to ministry while making a lot of money and being in more prestigious, glorious positions. My conversation with God was, how come that wasn't my path? And the Lord was just silent. For 2 years, let's be honest, 2.5 years, I pouted my way to work every day. That is not the pathway to greatness. That is the pathway to mediocrity. And I struggled for 2.5. You can talk to my wife, Faye, in those years. I was not easy to live. Well, I'm still not easy to live with, but it was harder to live with me back then. How many of you were in that situation? You're going, God, you've forsaken me. God, I hate my boss. I hate my job. I hate my coworkers. None of you have ever been there. Because David will tell you, little do you know it, but if you're faithful in the grind, you're on the pathway to greatness. Your next season of greatness. Well, about 2.5 years in, I repented, and God got a hold of me enough that I chose to change my attitude, understanding this was God's path for me. Quit comparing yourself with everybody else. And there was this one obnoxious kid out of 28 kids. His name was Paris Hayashi. This kid, I might have hated more than other kids. But I saw leadership in him. I saw leadership in him when we were in difficult situations. He had guts because he stole some of our score keys and cheated on tests and stuff like that. But he did it so well and hid it so well, I thought, there's got to be leadership in a guy like that. Now, mind you, he was 13 years old. Well, years would go by. That class of 28 yielded 6 people into full-time ministry and 4 pastors. Most of the people that I understand now were in my class have become very, very successful today. Many of them refer to the 3 years we spent together, and some of them have told me, those were the best years of my life. I told one of the guys, I said, you need to get out more, because those were the worst years of my life. And they said, we know, but at least it was real. Well, what glory is that? You're bleeding all over your flock. This was not David. I was the antithesis to David. But the last 2.5 years were good. Well, fast forward, we would have the need to bring on someone on staff to handle worship. And 22 years ago, that was where we were. And so I brought Paris Hayashi on the team. And for 22 years, he served faithfully here in very difficult times, many times in obscurity, many times you didn't notice him. He didn't preach all that much. He was given opportunities to lead worship a lot because it's a gift, and he said, no, we need to profile other people. But that faithfulness today has made him the oversight pastor, or I call him, the biblical term is bishop, over all of our congregations. Now, Pastor Billy Lyle is the senior pastor and lead pastor of this main campus. But the executive overseer, the coach, is Pastor Paris. And the trail can go back all the way into the 80s when he was in my middle school class. That was the flock of sheep. That was the flock. Well, forget church. Got married to a beautiful queen named Twinkle. And of course, like every married couple, you want to have kids. Because everybody has kids. You know, some people, they sneeze and they get pregnant. Right? I mean, and some people have to try so hard. You know that phrase, it's painful as a pastor. He says, well, how's it going? He said, we're trying. But actually, God's the one who opens the womb. God's the one who gives life. We have no control over that. I almost want to tell people, quit trying. And let's have more praying so that God gets the credit. God is the one who authors just a great, great stewardship of parenting the sheep that he gives you. So they decided to foster. In other words, fostering, taking care of other people's kids. The kids, however, in the foster system that nobody wants are sick often because they've had to take care of kids with cancer, kids who've been abused, kids who've been abandoned, other people's sheep. And over the last couple of years in particular, they've been very faithful with the most difficult children at shepherding a flock of foster children. You say, well, anybody could do that, really? Because if it was so easy, then why isn't everybody doing it? Instead of pouting and stewing and comparing, they said, well, if God's not giving us our own kids, there's lots of kids who need shepherding, and we're going to take care of them. And it's been a freeway of foster kids. In fact, I in a separate meeting with Pastor Paris, I said, brother, enough, plenty. He said, no. He and Twinkle have continued to be faithful. And just last week, I was told that Twinkle has now conceived, that she's 3 months pregnant. Faithful. In privacy, obscurity, in the grind to shepherd what belongs to somebody else. Lots of sacrifice in giving. And now God says, I want to reward that faithfulness and give you a child of your own. And I want to ask Pastor Paris and Twinkle, if you could come and comment on this as we come to a climax this morning before we enter worship. I have talked over years as a pastor to couples that could not conceive. Every gamut of emotion comes out. This couple just said, we trust God. He is the only one who opens the womb. Therefore, we will give ourselves to take care of other people's children and sacrifice for the greater good. And I talked to my wife about this in private. And some of the conversation is, are you crazy? Because it's so difficult. What have you learned and how has God formed you through this incredible journey of faithfulness?
You know, when we first made the decision to become foster parents, obviously, many of you know the story. We lost our first child. Twinkle had a miscarriage. But that kind of became the impetus for us to step into fostering. And when you hear the story of fostering, many times you hear the good stories of fostering. But when you get into it, you actually see the reality of the children that come into your home, the brokenness, the hurt, the violations. And sometimes in the midst of that, I had that thought, am I crazy? Is Twinkle crazy? What are we doing? And the first child we had was a cancer girl. And we spent more time in the hospital than at home. But I learned this, and I was just talking with Twinkle here, is that God gives you the grace in the moment. He may not give you the grace, full grace at the beginning, but he enlarges the grace as time progresses. And the scripture that comes to my mind is, my grace is sufficient for you. And I think I've held on to that promise. I've held on to that word because at times it's been difficult. We have had 15 foster children have come into our home. Some have been very challenged in just their makeup, and we have, but we were challenged in that. But there have been so precious times. I remember probably the one time that really marked my life, and God enlarged the grace and his love for these kids, because they're not our own. And to love them as your own is very challenging. So it was the turn of the new year in 2021, and we had Selena Hope, our youngest, who's been now with us the longest. And it was New Year's Eve, the bombs were bursting in the air, and I was praying into the new year, and as I was holding her, all of a sudden, I could sense the presence of God in the room as I was holding her. And as I was praying in the new year, as I was praying for her, I felt like this, if you have a mental picture of a heart, I felt that heart enlarge and enlarge. And I felt the love of Christ come in. And that's what's given us the grace, the strength to walk through difficult times, to take care of them with the love of God and the grace of God.
So the miscarriage came right after his 50th birthday, and it was pre-COVID. In the year 2019, I actually got prophesied by Jim LaFoon. He said that God said, you will be a mother, regardless of what that looks like, whether it's foster, adoption, or your own, but you will be a mother. And I held on to that. I believed for that. And then COVID hit, 2020, and at home, doing nothing, I said, Lord, how can you use me? How can you use us? What can I do to serve you? Scripture says true pure religion is to take care of the orphans and the widows. And so we've had that conversation after the miscarriage. Let's do this. And it was the time with COVID that we were trained online, and we were able to do it from the comfort of our home, and it was God's timing. And in 2 years, having 15 children, it wasn't always easy, but I knew we were in the center of God's will and calling for our lives, and that He was creating in us a new wineskin to be able to handle what's next. This promotion, this new house, all these things, ministry, growing our faith, growing our character in the midst of all that, all the struggle. And so, I think we're now in this place where this blessing now truly is God. I'm turning 40 this month, and it's God's perfect timing in the waiting, in being faithful with the little. God will honor you, and he'll be able to entrust you with so much more.
Yeah, we have had 15 children, and right now we have 2. I think we have a picture on screen.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, this is our 2 youngest. Yeah, look at that. They're so cute. 3 girls, including my wife.
Let me be honest disclosure. This is the 2 best looking, most normal picture. Because if you've seen the movie Modern Family, okay, you can't go to heaven. You need to see the movie Modern Family along with Rocky, Saving Private Ryan, and Band of Brothers, okay? They've had adolescent girls. Because we all know when they're young, when you tell them to jump, they say, how high? When they become adolescents, they go, how come? And you've had the gamut of the most difficult ages. The age that I had difficulty with you, you've had them in your home. A parting shot to all of us, because this has been a rich journey in obscurity and in the grind.
I think it comes down to being obedient to the Lord. Because I think when you hit the hard valley moments, even as David said, though I walk to the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. We are able to pull on the grace of God and the love of God in the challenging situations, with challenging people, And you're able to pull on that to keep on walking, to keep on moving forward. And wherever you are in your season of life, don't give up. God is with you on the mountaintops and the valleys. And I want to say, add one thing. One of the teenagers, middle school girl that came into our house and now has went on into a different season of her life, she actually talked to her social worker. We just found this out about 3 weeks ago. This is breaking news that she actually told the social worker, I want to go back to the Hayashi home and I want them to be my forever home. And that kind of signifies that we are doing the right thing, even in the difficult situations. And so, pardon me.
Yeah, just that God is good. God is faithful. He's sovereign. And He knows what He's doing, and He's going to use all for the good. And just trust Him. Surrender to Him and allow Him to do the work in your life as you serve, as you bless others around you. And
Yeah, so good. Twinkle lost her father on Valentine's Day and had to grow up with a good portion of her life without dad. Pastor Paris was adopted. They have a fresh appreciation for people who take care of other people's sheep. My own sister's adopted, and I saw my father go deep into Kalihi housing and take into our home a girl from a Samoan family. You know, God's always putting us in the anvil of a grind that seems difficult. I just want to say to you, thank you. This has not been easy. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Because, you know, those of us on staff know the path and the journey. But greatness, according to the Bible, is sacrifice and serving not for our entitlement, but for the greater good. And Pastor Paris, before you take the helmet and lead us into worship, wherever you are today, however difficult it feels, however ignored you feel, God has not made a mistake. It's just the pathway to greatness. You can't feel it now, okay? Don't compare yourselves with others. God knows what He's doing. I can only imagine Twinkle going, why can't I have a child? Everybody has children and it seems so easy. They didn't pout. They just said, we'll give ourselves for the greater good. Because there's lots of children that need a shepherd. One final thought, just before Pastor Paris comes. God is always the source. They have led many of these children to Jesus while they were in their home. We forget it's not about just caring for them, it's leading them to Christ. So God is always the source and should always get the credit. Look at what David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go and the Lord be with you. Why? Because David was so repetitive and insistent that his confidence and ability came from God. It would be God who gives the victory, and the same God who gave David the victory and who has given Pastor Paris and Twinkle the victory will give you the victory. If you keep your eyes on Him, that He knows what He's doing, that as Twinkle said, He's sovereign. He doesn't have you on a path of aberration or mistake. It is a pathway to greatness. But like David, keep your eyes on Jesus. It was so clear that even King Saul said, okay, go, and may the Lord be with you. Here's my greatest step in this new role. My greatest step in my next season that God would have me to be great, to serve, is I now need to serve Pastor Billy and Pastor Paris, who served me for so long, and I need to be faithful to serve them. Sometimes for older guys, that's not always easy. But I have determined and I have resolved that I want to serve them so they become greater than I have ever been, so that you can become a church that's greater than you have ever been. And that's the spirit. That's the pathway. Whoever is above you and around you, determine, God, you will give me the grace which is sufficient to serve even though I feel mistreated, even though it's difficult, even though it's hard, because it is. It starts with the Lord who gave Himself as a ransom, and it will end with the Lord who will bring us into greatness. Pastor Paris?